Good evening, and welcome to the Hollywood Babylonians. Hello, friends. This is your happy Hollywood history host, Mr. Ben Burke, here today with my brilliant friend and co-host, Mr. Garrett McPherson, to talk about the legend behind Robin Hood himself. If you enjoy what you hear today, be sure to tune in on Friday to hear us talk about the complete production history behind the Technicolor epic, The Adventures of Robin Hood, from Warner Brothers in 1938, starring Olivia de Havilland and Errol Flynn, only on the Hollywood Babylonians. I asked you before we started recording if you would look into the legend of Robin Hood, just for our listeners, before I start talking about the making of Robin Hood.
Yeah, definitely. It is interesting. This telling of Robin Hood stems from specifically Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, which came out in the early 1800s. Sir Walter Scott was a Scottish author, and that really shaped the myth we know today and the legend we know today of Robin Hood. There were elements of a lot of things from it beforehand. That's definitely the telling that influenced this film the most. There are some key differences to point out. One of the things is he's Sir Robin of Locksley, which makes him a lord, which is something that the original legends don't have. It wasn't until about 200-300 years after it first started popping up that he was a nobleman, which was important because early on the stories are telling he was a yeoman, is what it was called. And a yeoman is kind of, to put it into kind of modern terms, it's kind of like a middle-class National Guardsman is basically what yeomen were. They were farmers and guards, and they had military training, but they weren't knights and they weren't peasants. So they were free, but they kind of lived in this middle ground. The big thing is, and a big thing that contributes to this legend, is yeomen were specifically trained to be longbowmen. So they were great archers. That's part of the reason, like, Robin Hood was a yeoman, right? Like, that was his thing. They specifically came to prominence during the 100 Years' War, which is a series of wars between France and England. Joan of Arc is that period, Henry V. That's all within that conflict. And so what you would have, these yeomen go off to war. They bring back some spoils and things like that. But then you come back, and a lot of those people would become outlaws because they have skills that are violent, and it's the Middle Ages. There's not a lot of money running around, so if you become a highwayman or an outlaw, like, that's an easy way to make a living. So early on, historically, you get references to these Robin Hoods. And Hood was a very common last name, and Robin was an alternate spelling for the name Robert. So it's a very, very common name. And it was also potentially a euphemism for outlaws in general. So you would call Robin Hood almost like it's not the same thing, but like a John Doe is how we use that. Like, there may be someone named John Doe, but we use John Doe to describe someone we don't know. Robin Hood is the same, but with criminals. So you do have some Robin Hoods with that name pop up in the historical record. What's interesting about the original ballads is they actually set Robin Hood, the legendary character, later in history than this movie takes place. Originally, they set him in, I believe, the 14th century against King Edward I. Is kind of what he's first comes about, which, if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, King Edward Longshanks was his nickname. That is that time period, which leads some people to think, it's not definitive, but some people do think that William Wallace, who's the lead character in Braveheart, is an inspiration of Robin Hood. Although, as you research it, you do find that almost any historical figure who rebelled against a king, they're like, yeah, that's Robin Hood. So it's kind of it's kind of muddy. Yeah, he starts off as a yeoman, and then kind of as the ballads develop, there was a guy named Richard Grafton who wrote, I believe he wrote History Britannica, essentially, of Britain, and he placed Robin Hood as a noble. And then there was a guy about 100 years later named Anthony Munday who wrote 2 plays that Robin Hood was a noble. And from then on, that's what the story has been. And so why that's important is because one of the things Prince John does in the movie is he makes him an outlaw. He strips Robin of his titles and lands. So part of the movie is him restoring his own title by bringing King Richard back. And so I thought that was interesting because it's something that obviously that changed. Some other things I found that were interesting that developed along with the legend was in some early tellings of the legend, Little John was actually the leader of the Merry Men. And Little John, historically, as well as Friar Tuck, were actually kind of characters from other legends, and they all kind of mix. It's honestly, like, as silly as it sounds, it's like comic books. It's like the Marvel Extended Universe. It's like the MCU, because you have these individual characters that come together and tell the same story, which I thought was interesting, because it's like, you think that's a new thing, but it's not at all. We've been doing that for centuries, fan fictioning our favorite characters into whatever we want. Yeah, so Little John was definitely early in the Robin Hood legend. Much the Miller's son, who is in this film as well. I didn't realize that was his name, but he's the first guy who Robin saves from being killed because he's hunting the deer. Yeah, he's really early in the Robin Hood legends when he pops up. But Friar Tuck and Maid Marian are probably some of the last to be introduced. And those actually come from, they're called Mayday games. Have you seen the movie Midsummer?
Yes, I have. Yeah. So that's, I want to remember it. I've seen it.
Yeah, but that's Mayday. So Mayday festivals are those things. So if you kind of think that was what kind of pushed the Robin Hood legend along for a long time. That actually Anthony Munday, the guy who wrote those plays, they were Mayday plays. So there was a time where every 1st of May during the festivities, Robin Hood games is what they were called, but they were plays that would be put on. And so that's how they introduced Friar Tuck and Maid Marian.
So did Maid Marian ever have Robin Hood sacrificed, like in Midsummer?
I don't think so. But like, there's tons of stories about his death. Robin Hood has died many times.
As has Sherlock Holmes and...
Oh, yeah, everyone. Yeah. Sherlock Holmes and Iron Man. Actually, Maid Marian's original name was Matilda. Yeah, so they were around with the Mayday games. So whoever was putting on the Mayday games would dress up as Robin Hood, and their people would be the Merry Men. It was a costume party, essentially. Henry VIII made a big deal one year and dressed up as Robin Hood with his court and ran around into, I guess it probably, from the date I saw, it probably would have been Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, just burst into the door as Robin Hood, as Merry Men. So
that's amazing.
That was kind of fun. Yeah, those guys come into the legend late. What comes into the legend very late is the whole idea of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor.
Really?
That is not present early.
So, real fast, before stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, was he just an outlaw in the legends before that? Was there any reason given to why he was...
He was kind of an asshole. Like, he was kind of a jerk. Like, you read a lot of things. Edit that out.
Robin Hood, like Errol Flynn.
Yeah, exactly. Robin Hood was kind of a jerk. It's funny. I mean, from a modern lens, he was a jerk. Those early legends, he kills a lot of people for no reason. Like, a lot of people. But a lot of what he did early on, he was used as a tool to, like, reassert, like, chivalry and canon law and things like that. So he was very much kind of a preserver of the status quo. Is interesting because that's not how we look at him now. So one of the early stories that people kind of use as an example of steal from the rich, give to the poor was, so he comes across this knight who is down on his luck, and the knight has no money. But the knight is still obviously a nobleman because he's a knight. He helps the knight out, lends him some money. Some things happen. There's a lot that goes on. The knight ends up harboring Robin Hood and his merry men. And Robin actually, he doesn't require the knight to pay him back. He says, you can keep the money. So that was an example early on of like, oh, it was chivalrous. What he did was like charity and things like that. And there's also a lot of things about how, like, Robin Hood kills a lot of monks early on. because at the time, like there was a lot of corruption with the clergy taking land and money and more than they were owed. So there's a lot of stories of like greedy churchmen and Robin Hood going up against those people. But he's never like, for a long time, he's never stealing from the rich and just throwing money out to the poor. Like he holds feasts and things like that people can come to. It wasn't, from what I remember just looking into it, that really wasn't cemented until the French Revolution, where they were like, no, he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And that's because there was a history written there that the guy was like, this is what he did. And this guy's a historical figure and did exist.
Right. It validated what the revolutionaries.
Yeah, exactly. It validated it. And I mean, that's really stuck with it since then, to the point that I was reading in the 50s, during the McCarthy era, there was a senator who pushed to get Robin Hood banned in schools because he thought it promoted communism, which I do find funny because historically looking at this, the people who are interested in Robin Hood are the people in charge. And that's something I found, like, it's always meant something different to different groups of people. So obviously King Henry VIII is a king, right? But he sees himself as the rightful king. So Robin Hood's whole shtick, it's not that he doesn't support the monarchy, he doesn't support Prince John. He supports King Richard. And so you have people like King James the First and the Sixth of Scotland, who was right after Queen Elizabeth. He loved Robin Hood plays. He had Robin Hood plays played at court when he was just the King of Scotland, which, you know, historically that makes sense, right? Like, then he goes on to be the rightful King of England because there's no heir. Another example I found that was interesting is during the Protestant Reformation, Protestants loved Robin Hood because of his opposition, seemingly, to the Catholic Church. Now, it was greedy clergymen. Like, Robin Hood also early on is written as like a very staunch Catholic. He goes to mass, like, you know, he does things, but there was enough tradition of him doling out justice to greedy churchmen that the Protestant Reformation loved it. Another one that I found super interesting because it deals with both sides of it is during the English Civil War. So Oliver Cromwell, right? For basically Robin Hood plays were always going on. They existed during Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare mentions Robin Hood plays in a couple of his plays. And so, but there was a pause during the English Civil War. I think it was 1647. We learned about it in theater history when they stopped having theater. No Robin Hood plays, obviously, for those 13 years, I think it was. But then when King Charles was reinstituted as the monarch of England, Robin Hood plays became very popular because the rightful monarch is reinstituted as king, which is the crux of the Robin Hood legend, which I thought was cool and really interesting. And there is true history in that because King Richard of England did go on a crusade and he was kidnapped and ransomed. He was kidnapped and ransomed by the Duke of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor, which is interesting because he was on a crusade.
Right.
But there's a whole bunch of politics and history and things like that with the Crusades that's super complicated. But there were a lot of Christians fighting Christians, which isn't our traditional view of the Crusades. So while that was gone, while he was off on crusade, he instituted a few guys in power. Specifically, he basically shored up his position so that while he was gone, Prince John wouldn't take over. Because Prince John was his father's favorite son. There's actually a good movie, since we're talking about films, is The Lion in the Winter.
Yes.
That's all. That's what this whole relationship is, what it's about. So if you want a prequel to Robin Hood, you should watch that one. Because in that one, Prince John is kind of a loser, right? Like I
haven't seen that in a long time.
I think he's like the acne-faced one that he's like, everybody's like, this guy sucks. And
I think so. I was just obsessed with Katharine Hepburn. Yeah, and that's all I watched it for.
But yeah, that kind of sets up the position of everything. King Henry I think it's the 4th. I might be wrong. Maybe it's the 3rd. His favorite son is Prince John, but Prince John is like, he's not the heir to the throne, right? Richard is older. So when Richard leaves, he puts a couple people in charge. Immediately, the first person he puts in charge dies, and then the next 2 guys up don't get along. So Prince John sees an opening and tries to hold a rebellion against Richard. He goes to France. He tries to get an alliance with King Philip. Doesn't really work out. He has some popular support, but militarily, he's not. His forces aren't there. So Richard takes the throne back, comes back to England, and in the historical record, pardons John, so he doesn't execute John. Then he, basically for the rest of Richard's reign, John is historically like a very loyal prince. And then when Richard dies, Prince John, from Robin Hood, becomes the rightful king of England. and rules for, I think, 16 years. Yeah, so it's really interesting that, like, he's his brother, right? So, like, at this time, there are wars of succession, and he's not the rightful king, but he's not the wrong king, if that makes sense. Like, historically speaking. Like, he is the son of the king. He's actually this